You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
Episode 139, The Paradox.
Welcome to The Paradox with your attending, Dr. Eric Larson. He is a practicing anesthesiologist and clinical assistant professor at Michigan State University College of Human Medicine. Listen in as he takes you behind the scenes of what practicing medicine in today's ever-changing world is like with another doctor. The Paradox is a fun and accidentally informative show for physicians, patients, or anyone who has ever found themselves in a waiting room.
Welcome to The Paradox. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Larson. Thank you for joining me as we explore the U.S. medical system in a fun and informative format through expert analysis. And today we're going to be talking about mandatory COVID vaccinations. And before you get too excited, we're going to go into this quite a bit. But I've got some other non-COVID episodes coming up in the future. We're also now recording this on YouTube. And if you want to see my mug, you're welcome to go to YouTube. Go to my channel, subscribe, hit the notification button. That way you can see the videos when they come up. Or if you just can't unsee what you've seen so far, I suggest you go to a podcast player and you can listen to the usual audio format for the show. And you can just look for The Paradox. Again, that's Paradocs and Paradox Podcast by Eric Larson. You'll find it there. So there are two different ways to get this information. I encourage you to continue sharing the show. It's what makes it so popular and what makes it grow. I really appreciate that. If you'd like to support the show in another manner, I appreciate all the support on Patreon, which helps fund all the equipment and the stuff, promotion we use for the show. You can go to patreon.com/theparadox. And again, that's Paradocs. And there you can contribute even a small monthly fee of $1 to $2 or up to $5, $10, $25 if you want to be really generous. And you can support the show that way. I also encourage you to contact me at my website at theparadox.com. And there you can email me with show ideas, people I should interview, those sorts of things. But first, a brief word from our sponsor, Advice Media. It's not a secret that doctors have a hard time creating a professional-looking digital presence. Having a dynamic website, ranking in Google, or growing your volume of patient reviews are not easy tasks. We're too busy to figure it out on our own. Over the last 20 years, Advice Media has developed the pyramid of success to help physicians do just this. Do you want to attract more patients, generate more calls and emails, enhance brand awareness, protect your online reputation? Schedule a demo with Advice Media to learn how. On top of that, receive a $60 Amazon gift card just for chatting with them. 3 in 5 patients will choose one provider over another because of a strong online presence. Are you making sure you're the one who stands out? Don't delay booking your demo today. Go to drpodcastnetwork.com/advicemedia. That's drpodcastnetwork.com/advicemedia. But today we're going to be talking about COVID and mandatory vaccinations. I just can't not talk about this right now. We've spent a lot of time talking about COVID in the show. And there's a foundation of information that you can access in the show. I'd suggest you go to these places. And so you can go to see episode 96. We talk about how we transition from a pandemic, which is what we're sort of exiting at this point. We're transitioning to endemic, where SARS-CoV-2 is everywhere. And it'll be something that's with us forever. Just the other day, I was reading that now 60% of deer in the state of Michigan, where I live, have come out seropositive for SARS-CoV-2, which means they've been infected. They don't actually exhibit any signs or symptoms, but they are another pool, reservoir for the virus. So it shows that it's not going anywhere. No matter what we do as far as humans, it's going to be around forever, and we're just going to have to learn to live with this. You can go to episode 99, where I talked with Dr. Francis. We talk about myocarditis. Episode 116, we talk about PCR and the whole testing regime and how the cycle times work and the importance of those numbers. We talk about mandatory vaccine passports, which is episode 123. 127, we talk about Independence Day, and we'll address that again today. But if you want to get some other foundational science, you can just search for Dave Graham, or episodes 128, where I talk with Dr. Norchasm about natural immunity versus vaccine-induced immunity. And then also go into that a little bit more, too, with Dr. Gandhi, who is an infectious disease physician from UCSF. And we talk about T cells and basically the Delta variant. And so we're going to talk about that today, of course, too. And that's episode 132. So you can go to all those at theparadox.com/ whatever the show number is, 132, 128, etc. You can also go to the show notes page at theparadox.com/139. That will be this show. And there you can get links to all those episodes, and it'll be a brief write-up of what we're going to talk about today. So I think it's important to go through, set the table, so to speak, for what we're going to talk about. We're going to be talking about mandatory vaccination for COVID. SARS-CoV-2 is a virus that causes COVID-19. If you're asymptomatic, you technically don't have COVID-19. You just had an infection with SARS-CoV-2. It's not that important that you have that designation, but just recognize when you hear things, people talk about those, that's important to know. All right, when we talk about vaccines and SARS-CoV-2 and COVID, it's real important for all of us to kind of take a step back and address our priors, meaning accept sort of where you come on the controversy or when it comes to vaccinations, when it comes to COVID, whether you believe it's real, whether you believe it's the worst thing ever, it's deadly, it's a touch of death as soon as you get COVID, or you're somewhere in between, which is what I imagine most people are. When it comes to vaccines, there are people who think vaccines are a great idea. There are people who think vaccines are a terrible idea. Most people are probably somewhere in the middle, somewhere between those two extremes. And we're going to be talking to those people today. If you're a huge adherent or absolutely 100% opposed to the vaccines, I don't know that I'm going to offer a whole lot. Although I'd hope that you'd accept the fact, whatever your position is, and then say, oh yeah, this is a different position, I guess, a different point of view. I'm not here to convince you that you're totally wrong or totally right, but I just want you to get some more information. And I think certainly, if anything, be more humble and accepting that other people may have opinions which are not arrived at on malice, that they're looking to destroy people, but that they're actually, I guess I think people have the best of intentions, and that this is why they come to their conclusions, rightly or wrongly. But we're going to try and use science. We're going to try and use evidence, whatever, to try and come to an idea of sort of where we are. I tend to politically, I'm libertarian, which means I tend to move towards freedom, I guess, and not coercion for doing things. And so mandates are going to have a certain, that's how I'm going to approach mandates. And so I just want you to know that ahead of time as well. When it comes to SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, I think some things we need to sort of accept as facts. One is that COVID-19 has killed a lot of people. You may disagree as how many people it's killed, how much of a problem that is, but I think there's no question that it has killed a lot of people in this country. We'll just focus on the United States. 500,000, give or take, some. And, I think honest people can disagree with how much they think that is, but a lot of people have died because of SARS-CoV-2 infections. And we can discuss whether that was going to happen anyway. These are just people who are, for sure going to die in the next year or so, and the actual excess deaths just moved deaths ahead a year or two. I don't know. I'm not going to get into those discussions, but let's just accept the fact that it's a real thing. What its origins are, not something we're going to discuss today, but just the fact that SARS-CoV-2 is a real thing, and it's something that we should take seriously. That being said, other things. Treatment is much better than it was at the beginning of the pandemic. When you look at what we were doing in March of 2020, we're now not intubating everyone, meaning putting them on ventilators. We have medications that are somewhat effective. There's controversy about what treatments work best before as an outpatient and those things, and I'm not going to get into that. I've not studied that much, and I don't pretend to know a whole lot about it. But just, I think the fact is that treatments are better, and our understanding of the disease is better in some ways, and yet it's not very well understood in many ways as well. And so things that sometimes people say are facts, I think we have to recognize whether they really are facts or not, or whether they're suppositions, guesses, educated guesses. And a lot of that we're going to talk about today. I'm going to try and be honest and be upfront, at least hopefully tell you when there are things I think versus things that we know. So we know that SARS-CoV-2 causes COVID-19. We know for sure, we've known for over a year now, that it afflicts the elderly at a much higher rate, meaning it's much more lethal to elderly by orders of magnitude over children. And by children, I mean kids like under 12, 16, even 20-year-olds. And so I don't think there's anyone who contests that reality. When it comes to the vaccines, whether you like them or don't like them, They are highly effective at preventing mass spread of SARS-CoV-2. I don't think there's any question about that. Areas where there's high levels of vaccination, there are less people in the hospitals, the amount of people getting very sick, and all the studies clearly show that it doesn't cause as much problems for serious illness, which is exactly what we hope for the science, that we'd have these vaccines and they would prevent serious illness, ICU stays, hospitalizations, etc. So I think we accept that the fact that that's true. The extent to which it does, how long it lasts, what are the side effects for the vaccine. Those things are another thing we can discuss. But I think we should accept the fact that the vaccines are highly effective, and as far as we can tell, they're extremely safe. No medication, no treatment, nothing you do is without risk. And so to say that they are dangerous, I think is hyperbole. To say that they are without any risk at all and they're totally safe is also not true. But I think it's fair to say they're highly effective and very safe. And so I think we'll just leave that there. And I would hope that's a level we can all accept as fact. We're going to talk about things that aren't facts too. When it comes to the Delta variant, is it real? Is it super deadly? Is it something that we need to be super scared of? Like I said, I've talked about that before with Dr. Gandhi in episode 132. I'd encourage you to go back there. We're going to talk about Delta, but I mean, there's Epsilon, there's Zeta, Theta. I don't remember how much farther the Greek alphabet I can go. I was an engineer, but I don't remember all the different terms. We didn't use all of them. I think I was iota. Anyway, I'd encourage you to look at that when it comes to COVID and how deadly it is or what sort of things work. I think we're going to talk about some things that I think, are important to know, because there's some things that are not facts that are treated as facts. And I think we just need to recognize what are guesses, what are educated guesses, what's just pure, nothing based on fact at all. Just we think would be a good idea, but we may not. So another thing that's obviously true is vaccinations. The rate of vaccination, meaning the people who are going to get vaccinated, has pretty much stalled out in this country. There's sort of a vaccination level. People who are excited to get the vaccine have gotten it. There are obviously people who are too young to get it. Those children under the age of 12, they have not gotten the vaccine. They're not allowed to by the FDA, and that will change probably in a couple months. I'm not sure exactly when. And there'll be a big slew of people getting the vaccine at that point. Excuse me. But how many people get it after then is going to be really dependent, I think, on the messaging. And I don't know at this point if the messaging can change significantly to really change the tide as far as vaccinations. When you look at the CDC site, they say how many people have gotten vaccinated. I think we're around 60% or so the country of adults have gotten vaccinated at least once. How many more are waiting to get vaccinated at this point? It's hard for me to imagine there are a whole lot of people who have been just waiting. I think there are people who are looking for more information, but people who are excited to get vaccinated, who want to get vaccinated, they've all gotten vaccinated. And I think we've kind of hit a peak of people who will get vaccinated, barring some further evidence or reason to get vaccinated. And I think there are plenty of reasons to get vaccinated. I've been vaccinated, so I believe that SARS-CoV-2 is real. I feel COVID's real. I believe that people can get really sick from it, and people can be totally asymptomatic and have it and not even know it. And I've met all these people in my dealings in the hospital, and just friends and family and people I talk to, colleagues. And so I think, the spectrum of people, how they get sick from COVID is as varied as you see reported. People say, it's no big deal. And other people are on oxygen for like 6 months. They never quite recover. They seem to have long-term problems, or some people succumb to it and die. I've seen everything in between. So it's all true in the sense that COVID can be any of those things. And none of them at the same time, right? So when it comes to statistics, I've always said this before, you're either 0 or 100, right? If it doesn't happen to you, it's 0%. If it does happen to you, it's 100%. But when you look at large populations, you look, what's the chance of dying from when you contract SARS-CoV-2? Well, if you're a kid, it's almost 0. It's as close to 0 as you possibly could be. And if you're elderly, it's much, much higher, and 5-10%, just depends on sort of comorbidities and how frail you are. And so when we look at that, I think we need to keep that in perspective, because those numbers I think are pretty accurate. The exact extent and how much more dangerous is the flu and those sorts of things, I don't know that we know that. All we know is that the flu is far more dangerous to kids than COVID, but it doesn't mean that there aren't people who get sick from COVID as well. So when we talk about mandatory vaccinations, you're starting to see federal workers, military, and you're seeing all kinds of healthcare organizations now are mandating for employment, as a basis of employment, that you have to be vaccinated. And we're going to have to look at this as there's a tension, right? We have a tension of freedom and the ability to, the right to do what you want with your own body, to not take medicines against your will. And vaccine is a medication. It's something that causes an immune response in your body. It's more than taking like aspirin, but less than taking like chemotherapeutic agent, right? Somewhere in between. Far closer to aspirin probably than chemotherapeutic. However, it is a medication. It's you should have a right to your body and what you put in it. I think that's my prior. and the tension is, of course, is that if you are walking around and you're infected and you can infect other people, then obviously you're putting them at risk, right? And so this is the classic tension we have between freedom and your obligation to your other man. If you're a libertarian, you're not allowed to aggress or actually cause harm to others, even if it's accidental. So you can't drive 1,000 miles down the highway, and if you kill someone, that you're driving recklessly, right? And you're putting people at risk. And so where that tension is, where your rights end because you've put people at significant risk, and where you can do what you want, that's the tension, right? And so that's where we have to decide. And when we make our decisions and decide on what's mandatory and what's not mandatory, we have to keep in mind the situation. And I think it's real important to keep in mind the situation, because if we're talking about someone who is a camp counselor versus someone who's working in the ICU, I think they're different. They're different situations. And this is, I think, a reasonable sort of way of looking at the world. We can disagree as to where our lines are, and I think we're always going to disagree exactly where we think our thresholds are. But I think it's important that we recognize that's the argument we're having. It's not a question of whether the COVID's real. It's not a question of whether the vaccine works. It's not a question of whether the vaccine's dangerous. The real question is where do we put that level, the line of freedom versus restrictions, and then you have to take into account the risks of things that you're doing, right? So obviously, if you're just spreading a common cold, well, then you shouldn't have any restrictions, because for goodness sake, it's just a common cold and everyone gets it all the time. And there is an incredibly small risk to people who may be very frail and elderly, but for the most part, no one's going to die from a common cold. Versus if I'm walking around with a highly dangerous radioactive material in my pocket, that if you get within 10 feet of me, you'll die. And, if I'm doing that, then obviously I'm at risk for everybody. And so that I should not have a right to just walk around with a lethal agent. So that's kind of, we're somewhere in between, right? And I think it really depends on context of where we are. And so we've established that SARS-CoV-2 is not going anywhere. It's going to be with us forever. We have animal reservoirs. So we have to decide how we're going to live with this. And we have to use the science that we know to make these decisions. And that's where I think it's important for us to recognize what the state is on the ground, right, in the United States. There are a lot of people who've had SARS-CoV-2. There's probably a third of the country, we're estimating, have had it, which means they have natural immunity, which means they have immunity to SARS-CoV-2. Yes, they can get reinfected. Just as someone who's had a vaccine, who has vaccine-induced immunity, can also spread the infection, but it's probably very low. But also, who are you protecting at this point? At this point, there are two different groups you're protecting. People who can't get immunized for some reason, in this case, primarily children, young children, or two, people who've chosen not to protect themselves. There is a very, very small subset of people who are immunocompromised, who for whatever reason the vaccine won't be effective. I mean, the vaccine won't be effective at everybody anytime with any vaccine. And so those people are always going to be at risk, and you don't know who those people are generally. Some people you clearly do if someone's on immunosuppressant medications, but for the most part, you don't know who those people are. So if we want to mandate everyone to get a vaccine, we have to ask ourselves who we're protecting. And if we're protecting children, or we're protecting the people who've chosen not to get protection, I am okay with people who make the decision that they don't want a vaccine. I don't think it's prudent, and they can, again, do what they want. You're going to get SARS-CoV-2. You can't avoid it. It's clear that's going to happen. The Delta variant is, by all by all measurements, it is probably not any more deadly than any other previous coronaviruses, as far as we can tell, previous variants. However, it is probably more transmissible, which you'd expect that this virus would mutate and change throughout time in order to become more transmissible. That's its improved fitness in the wild, right? That it probably is not going to be more deadly. It probably, if anything, would move a little bit away from deadliness. But of course, virus doesn't care about that. They just care about replicating, getting to the next person. So if it kills you 3 years from now, the virus doesn't care, as long as it has a chance to get to the next person. But it's highly likely that the ones that are more likely to be transmitted will become the dominant strain. That's how sort of things work, right? It's more successful, and so it's going to transfer more people, and that people are going to have that one, and then they're going to give it to more people, and then very quickly you'll find a strain that becomes more dominant over other strains. And that's what we've seen with Delta pretty much around the world. So this fourth iteration or whatever, but it doesn't seem to be any worse. And also, when it comes to immunity, not surprisingly, we've seen the vaccine is very effective against this, just as natural immunity is effective against this, which is exactly what you'd expect. If you listen to Dr. Gandhi's interview that I did back in episode 132, we talk about T cells. When you make an immune response to the spike protein, which is what this virus has, they're like 100 targets, and if 10 of them change, you still have 90 targets remaining. So it's highly likely that your body will prevent a serious infection. Now, it may not have enough antibody protection mucosa to prevent an infection where you can still spread it potentially or get a little bit sick, but you should not get to the point of extreme illness and where you die. And if you look at most of the stats of people who are in the hospitals, they're people who previously are unvaccinated. Now, before, everyone was unvaccinated, so everyone in the hospitals went that unvaccinated stage. But now, people in the hospital are people who have not been vaccinated, which is not surprising. That's where you expect most of the infections to occur. People who haven't had it before or haven't been vaccinated. They have no pre-existing immunity, either through vaccine or through natural infection. And so that's exactly what you expect. And when you look at people who've been reinfected, not a whole lot, who've been vaccinated, generally speaking, they do not get as sick. Now, some of them do, and probably, but we don't know this for sure, probably your immunity is not as good with a vaccine as it is with the natural infection. But there's so many things that are in play that you can't say that with certainty, right? You might have had a mild case of natural infection, a very low viral load perhaps, or you got a different mutation that's not as, your response is not as good as it is to when you're re-exposed. And we know this because if people get vaccinated, they don't have 100% immunity to the viruses. That's sort of how they work. They usually work, but not in everyone. For whatever reason, you may not have gotten that immune response or the T cells, the B cells, the right ones to actually form, and so that when you experience it again, you may get really sick. But we know it's extremely effective, 90% or so. And so it's unlikely that people who have had the vaccine or had natural infection are going to be getting really sick. It doesn't mean it's zero. Similarly, when it comes to children, most children are totally fine, which means they might get sick. Some might even end up in the hospital. Some might get extremely sick. In the extremely rare instance, they may perish. That is, again, extremely unlikely. It doesn't mean it's zero, but we have to accept that fact that yes, they may get infected, and the Delta variant may show that they get infected more frequently, which we expect because it happens with adults. So kids can get infected more often. But our question has to be, is do we care? And so let's go through a few more things. When you look at hospitals right now, they are not getting overrun with COVID. They are getting busy sometimes, but even the worst scenarios, New York, right when it first happened, we did not run out of supplies. We had lack of protective equipment for staff and personnel. Not a problem anymore. So that was a problem initially. But when it came to hospital beds, ventilators, all those things, we had plenty. That wasn't the problem. And that was when the entire population was native, totally immune to, or had no immunity, right? Now, there's a significant portion of the population, wherever you go in the country, who have had it or who have vaccines. Even places where the vaccine levels are low and natural infection levels are low, like say 50% or maybe even less, under 50%. That still is a much smaller pool of people who can get sick at any one time. So it is, I'd say almost for sure in this country, there's no chance of us having the hospital overrun where we can't take care of people. It doesn't mean it won't get busy for a couple months or a couple weeks, but it doesn't mean that we're going to get to the point where we get people, dying in the hallways and no oxygen. It's just not something that's going to happen at this point. We've gotten through the worst of it for sure in this country. Again, this doesn't mean there'll be other surges or whatever you want to call them, but let's accept the fact that the hospitals will not get overrun. And so we don't need to worry about that particular aspect, especially if the largest portion of our population who are at risk for getting infected are children because they can't get vaccinated. We know kids just don't go to the hospital very often. I mean, it does happen before someone writes and says, hey, they go to the hospital. They don't go to the hospital very high rates. And so we don't need to worry about that as much. And so let's accept the fact that the hospitals will be okay. And hospitals are busy, but heck, the hospitals are always busy. I've been working in the hospital for 20 some plus years in my career. There are all kinds of times, not even during flu seasons, when the hospital's just full, their census is full for whatever reason. That just happens. That's normal. Hospitals don't run to be empty. If hospitals running and that's usually empty, then that's a serious problem. That means you have too many hospital beds, you have too much capacity, or you're not getting enough business. But that's a real problem. So hospitals work their darndest to avoid that problem. They want to be full. They want their ICUs full. They don't want it totally full, but they want it very full. It's like a hotel, right? You always want to have people in your hotel. You don't want to be usually empty and just, well, we're ready for when the big, when the one, football game happens this Saturday, we'll be ready to take everyone. Because that's not a way you could run a business, to have just wait for the rare instance when you're going to have that much business. You want to make sure you're usually full and utilized. That's just common sense. And so stories about hospitals being full or overrun because COVID or whatever, these are irritating to me because they don't suggest what's really going on. Yes, there are times when a lot more people come in, a higher percentage of patients have COVID, but it's usually not like 60% of the hospital or something like that. So I think we just need, when you see those headlines, just ignore them. They don't make any sense. And let's just accept the fact that there's a lot of scaremongering, and that's just the way the press works. So then let's talk about the vaccinations when it comes to mandatory status. Who should have a mandated vaccine? And I think the tension is the people who you're trying to protect and the people who have a reasonable expectation of safety. If you're someone who's immunocompromised, or you think this vaccine may not work, or I'm just not sure about things, then I would suggest that you need to think of your choices and your risks in life in general. And I don't mean this in a derogatory manner. I just mean that you have to start thinking about things like, if you think it's dangerous going to the grocery store, then you think it's dangerous going to the grocery store. Do you have a right to make sure that everyone there does everything in their way, goes out of their way in order to make sure you're safe? And this is the tension, right? I think it's unreasonable if you're someone who is at risk to expect everyone to bow to your risk profile, so what you think is risky. Meaning, I don't think it's reasonable for you to expect everyone to go out of their way and do things that they think are dangerous for whatever reason, or against the religion, or to get vaccinated, for instance, in order that you can be safe and do whatever you want. I think that's an unreasonable expectation. Do I think it's reasonable for you, if you are an immunocompromised person or for whatever reason you're at risk and you get sick, to have an expectation that when you go to some place that is there to provide healing for you, that you're in an environment that is relatively safe as far as contracting new diseases and problems, basically. And I think it probably is. And so when it comes to mandatory vaccinations for healthcare workers, I think it's a reasonable expectation for someone to go to a hospital or some health center. And I think, we can debate over what healthcare centers matter. Does optometrists matter? Well, probably not. But as you go into the hospital and you're in the ICU, I think it's reasonable to expect that people there are going to have immunity. Now, I'll make that designation because I think it's important. I think it's not fair to expect people who have immunity, who've experienced it naturally, to be treated as less than people who had vaccine-induced immunity, when there's plenty of evidence that suggests it's as good or better than vaccine-induced immunity. So I think if you have immunity, you should be treated the same as if someone who's vaccinated. I don't think there should be a special reason just for bureaucratic reasons that because, we can't keep track of all these things. That's a dumb way to set your policy, my opinion. Okay. So I think it's reasonable to say people are going to have immunity. People are going to be safer to be around than people who aren't. Now, does that mean I think everyone in the community has an obligation to provide a totally safe environment for you? I don't think so. And that's just my opinion. And I don't know how you can logically draw a line where someone's right and someone's wrong. I think it's just your opinion as far as the risk profiles. But I think you go to a healthcare setting, I think it's reasonable to expect that level of safety. But I think it's unreasonable to expect that in everyday workplaces, et cetera. Now, does that mean workplaces can say, hey, we think it's important for our workers to be safe and to have COVID vaccinations or some sort of immunity? I think that's for workplaces to decide and what's best for them. That's, again, a decision that I don't think is a government's decision. And then when it comes to schools, what do we do for schools? I mean, I think this is the argument that people will say, well, the reason we have to have mandatory vaccinations for adult populations is because we can't vaccinate the children. But we know that children, it's vanishingly small, the risk to children. And I think to claim otherwise is it's either unfair or it's being disingenuous. And by disingenuous, I mean the reason you're so concerned about kids getting it is not because kids are getting it. It's because you're worried kids are going to get it and it's going to cause an outbreak in the community. But you're causing an outbreak in the community of people who are, generally speaking, for the most part, who are going to be at most risk, people who have chosen not to get vaccinated to get protection anyway. So you're forcing children to get something in order to protect people who chose not to get protected. It doesn't make much sense to me. I don't understand that. And I think if you say, well, our concern is about the people who have breakthrough infections with vaccination, I think that's a vanishingly small number of people who are at significant risk for getting really sick from that. I just don't think that's not a reasonable argument in order to prevent kids from getting what they need. And I think this is where you have to also have a cost-benefit analysis on, what's best for children. We've already taken kids last semester of their year in 2020 away. Most of them lost all of 2020 and 2021. And by loss, I mean, obviously they're getting some instruction, but anyone who's gone through virtual schooling knows it's not as good. Anyone who's gone through hybrid knows it's not as good. I've talked to kids and they say it's not as good. It's real important, the socialization aspect of life for young people, and we've stripped that away from them. I think, we can make arguments whether that was a good idea or a bad idea, but I think, we have to look forward, what are we going to do this following year? And I think it's unreasonable to expect kids to sacrifice again just to protect people who've chosen not to protect themselves. It doesn't make much sense to me. If you're a teacher who is worried about infection and worried about breakthrough, I mean, if you're that frail of a person, then I think it's not an unreasonable concern, but you probably need to rethink, your job situation. If you're that sickly and you're around kids who, even before COVID, they're going to get you sick all the time. I fail to see how you can have an expectation for children to keep you safe. I don't know. I mean, and I think there are plenty of alternatives if parents chose to protect their kids and keep them from getting infected, which, again, you're going to get infected. If they're waiting for the vaccine will be out soon. I don't know why they care. That's just my own opinion. When it comes to children and can they get infected, is there concern about them? I think they're going to get infected, and they're probably going to be okay. And so I don't know that you have to worry about it. I also think the risks to the vaccine are really small too. In fact, incredibly low. People often point to the fact that vaccines, long-term effects we don't know. And that is always true. But once you get out more than a few months, it's going to be really hard to sort of establish a causation for whatever problems you have. And so it's very unlikely that you're going to have something that is going to cause a significant problem 3 months from now or 4 months or a year from now. Certainly be really hard to prove that it was a vaccine, but there's definitely risk to the viral infection. It's probably pretty small. The risk for a vaccine is even smaller. And those numbers we know when it comes to myocarditis, for instance. You can get myocarditis from just an infection. I think it's reasonable for parents to make those decisions on whether the kids should get vaccinated or not, and maybe talk to the kids and how the kids feel. But I think I would not worry about it. My kids getting vaccinated, like worry about anything happening. I think we've had plenty of safety profile of this vaccine at this point that it's unlikely that there's going to be anything new we're going to find out when it comes to vaccination kids. We may talk about dosing and those sorts of things, and those are, I think, valid discussions to have, and we'll do that in the future. So then when it comes to vaccines and mandatory nature of them, I think the critical question is really ask, what are we going to do? Because in my era, I think it's reasonable to have healthcare facilities expect to have immunization, either natural or vaccine-induced. But outside that, I don't think it's a reasonable expectation for someone to have impose that on someone else. And then what are you going to do if people decide not to do it? I mean, is it just for an infection that we know is not really that lethal for most people? Most people who are most at risk have been vaccinated, who've chosen to. I mean, obviously, the people at risk who chose not to get vaccinated. But those people have had the opportunity. You've had 6 months now, practically. Well, let's say 4 months to get fully vaccinated from this virus. So if at this point, if you're not, you've just chosen, you say, I don't care, which again, I said is fine. So what are we going to do to the people who've chose not to get vaccinated? I mean, we're going to prevent them from making any money. Are we going to prevent them from movement? Are we going to, I mean, essentially you're just saying we need to basically arrest these people. I mean, you're confining people to house arrest. You know, you're not allowed to go to any events. You're not allowed to make a living. You're not allowed to travel. That does not seem like the country that I grew up in. I recognize there's a level of fear, but again, what are we protecting? We're protecting kids because they can't get vaccinated. Well, there's not too much risk to the kids. And if someone's so terrified of the kids getting sick, you can certainly avoid them getting exposure. Or you're preventing people who've chosen not to protect themselves. Again, it doesn't. I'm struggling to figure out what the rationale is, because the numbers for the Delta variant, which everyone worries about, yes, people there are breakthrough infections, but these are not things that are getting people terribly sick. It's not like we're having a rash of people in the hospital who have been vaccinated or have previous immunity who are getting Delta variant. I mean, if that was the case, you would absolutely hear that. The rare instances when you hear people who've happened to, you certainly see that, but it's not a very common occurrence, and so is really hard for me to understand why this is an issue. Outside of the fact that people love pushing fear, and they love trying to control you or lord over you or be someone who's an important person who everyone listens to. Maybe I'm totally off. If there's some aspect of this argument that I'm missing, I'd encourage you to reach out to me and tell me why I'm wrong. I'd be really interested in hearing. But the arguments I don't hear is, well, it's worse than we think, because I think it's clear that Delta variant is more infectious, meaning it spreads faster, but it's not like killing lots of people who have been vaccinated or have a natural immunity, as far as we can tell. And kids still are no more at risk for significant problems, as far as we can tell at this point, than they were before. They are at a minuscule risk. They are at risk. I don't deny that, but it's not worse than we thought before. So again, I'm sort of puzzled at what we're doing. And there are absolutely costs to measures to prevent kids from going to school, or to have them wear masks, or to have them live in a perpetual state of fear. Because putting masks on kids absolutely is not just like, oh, it's just like putting on a scarf, right? We're having them basically look at the rest of the world as potential sources of harm, right? Because that's what we're saying to them. That is not a healthy way to have for your society for so many years. These kids are only 6 or 7 or 8 or 9, 1 year. And that's a lot different than someone who's 30, who's 31. Because I can tell you, after you get 26, you can rent a car. The birthdays are all the same. You just have more white hair and a couple more wrinkles. And so I really struggle in seeing my kids, seeing other people's kids really fight through this, and it's really hard on them. People who are just blasé about it and think, well, it's just a small sacrifice and kids don't care. Kids will wear them, and that's absolutely true. I could take every kid out of a house and make them all sleep in tents. And after a while, they just get used to it because that's just the way the world is. And if they're young, we all know this, right? If you have kids, you change the environment and they just adapt pretty quickly, unlike adults who don't adapt very quickly, right? But it doesn't mean it's right just because they can do it and just because they don't complain as much. I mean, we are absolutely taking away something from kids by subjecting them to these crazy circumstances. And the question is, for what? I have a hard time explaining this in my mind and to come to a realization for what it is we're doing. There doesn't seem to be any sort of scientific basis for what we're doing. We know, scientifically speaking, from studies that preventing kids from getting an education is a bad thing. So I don't know why that is not I don't know why the evidence has to be so overwhelming in order to take the position that we should restrict kids' educational options versus the other. I mean, it seems like, well, someone might get sick. So, and finally, one of the arguments that people throw at me, well, I've never been so healthy. And I would agree. I've never been so healthy in my last year and a half. I don't see many people anyway. I'm kind of introverted, which I guess why I have a podcast and talk to a camera and a microphone. But we shouldn't assume that the measures that we've done are ones that are effective. And by that I mean, if you look at things, and I would recommend you go to covidchartsquiz.com. This is obviously biased in the sense that it comes to the expectation that the masks are useless. But when you look at mandates for masks, it is hard to look at the data and find any sort of evidence that it's at all effective. When you look at lockdown measures, it's hard to see any evidence that there's any effectiveness to it outside of the extremes like something like Australia or New Zealand, where you are basically putting people under house arrest, welding them into their houses like they did in China, Wuhan. I mean, yes, if you keep people like locked away in their own house completely, you're going to stop the spread of these things. But that is so anti-human and in a disease that we have no treatment. Yes, we have a vaccine, but it's never going to go away. It's going to be, as soon as you let people get out, the virus will come back. Plus, we have plenty of animal reservoirs. It doesn't seem like there's much rhyme or reason to this sort of this strategy. So I think it's hard to look at the measures that we've done and to think that there's any use to it. And people will say, well, I've never had a cold. There's been no flu. And I would counter and say, well, you don't know it's because of masks. You don't know it's because of lockdowns. I mean, maybe. But I can come up with other reasons, like no one's showing up for work sick, right? You're not allowed to come to work if you got a cold or sniffles. You can't go to school if you're sick. Well, that could wipe out most colds right away, right? It'd be very hard for them to spread. And even COVID, you could argue, it's usually symptomatic when it's spread, not usually asymptomatic. Can occur, we're pretty sure. And so what actually causes the reduction in these other viral, viruses and other sicknesses? I don't know. There are all kinds of confounding reasons, and I wouldn't say that it's because of masks being worn. I mean, if that was, I know the common refrain is, well, if masks were effective, it would stop COVID, but it doesn't. But it stops everything else. Doesn't make much sense. But you look at mask wearing, and there are plenty of studies showing that there's plenty of viral particles shed in aerosols, and it doesn't make much difference at all. If someone comes with a TB, we don't assume you can put a surgical mask on and be okay, right? So it's kind of odd that it'd be okay for this. I wouldn't say that it makes no difference, but I think it's pretty clear that the mask mandates and the lockdown mandates don't change the course of the disease in the community very, very much. If so, it's almost impossible to detect because it's more of a regional and kind of just moves in its own way and just has its own pattern. We had a big surge in Michigan. It was just in Michigan. Didn't make any sense. Didn't even cross the border. It was weird. And we had totally different measures in place for preventing infection than our bordering states, Indiana, Ohio. So I don't know. I think there's a lot we just don't know. And I think we just have to be humble and accept the fact that we just don't understand it. And that's okay. But I think also this absolute belief that things get bad, we have to put the mask back on. Well, I don't know if there's any reason to think that that's making a difference. There are 100 other things that could be causing the reduction in cases or not reduction in cases. So again, I'm not convinced that that's the case. I reserve the right to be, or I reserve the right to be wrong, right? So I accept the fact that I might be totally wrong about that. So I hope this is helpful. I hope you recognize mandatory vaccinations, how they're a good idea and a bad idea. And I'd really appreciate any sort of feedback you have. You can get a hold of me at The Paradox Show at protonmail.com. You can email me with your thoughts and how I'm totally off or totally right or whatever. And if you have any other interview ideas, people I should talk to, I'd be happy to talk to them. We're going to try and get away from COVID now, as I really think this thing's about done, but it just keeps like lingering. Because I want to talk more about the healthcare system. I've got some good guests. We're going to talk about some cryptocurrencies coming up and how that affects you in medicine and how that should affect you, just the world economy. I think it's going to be a great discussion. And we're going to hopefully talk about, again, just other healthcare stuff and not just COVID, because although it's a really interesting puzzle to try and figure these things out, and it kind of drives me crazy sometimes when it comes to what's right, what's wrong, as far as when it comes to mandates and those sorts of things. I really kind of like to stop talking about this. And I'm sure everyone else feels the same way. Again, go to theparadox.com/139. There you can get the show notes for this show with links to all the other shows that I talked about, or you can just go to my blog at theparadox.com/blog. And there you can go and search for whatever topic interests you. And again, I appreciate everyone listening in, and I hope you have a great day, and I hope you have just a little bit less fear and a little bit more understanding for others. One last thing before we go, remember Advice Media. Don't forget to schedule a demo with them to receive the $60 gift card and strategic insight on what your current online presence is doing or not doing for you. Contact Advice Media at drpodcastnetwork.com/advice media. Again, that's drpodcastnetwork.com/advice media.
Thanks for listening to The Paradox. If you like what the doc is doing, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher. And share the show with your friends. Become a supporting listener to get access to special bonuses at patreon.com/theparadox. Show notes can be found at theparadox.com.